Hello, everyone. So we are from Veterinary Community Partnership, and today we have a Gardening 101 presentation for you. So my name is Shannon Herlihy, and I am an Eat 360 program coordinator. And with me today is Tara Bledsoe, who is one of our registered dietitians. So we're gonna go ahead and get started.
Yeah, so today, there are so many ways to have a vegetable garden, and really we want to offer you some tips. We're hoping that the take-home message is that you will feel confident to be able to go out and start planting in any way that you can. And since we're in the Philadelphia area, we're going to focus on container gardening and raised beds because we have to be really aware of our soil, and there is maybe some lead in the soil around our houses, and so it's better for us to have new soil that we're putting into the containers and raised beds. All right, so we're going to start with some container gardening tips. So you really need some big containers, and they also need to have really good drainage. So if you do get some DIY or free containers like your plastic cat litter containers, you want to make sure that you can drill some holes in the bottom for drainage. And those plastic cat litter containers are really good options as a free option. You might be able to get them from your neighbor. They're made with food safe plastic number 5. And so another tip is that when you are putting your soil in, you want to actually make it a mix of potting soil and compost. So you could roughly say like 3/4 of the mix is potting soil and the last 1/4 is compost. And you can see from these pictures that you can have container gardens out on a deck, on a patio, and so in very small spaces. Another option is to have raised beds. And different materials you can make raised beds out of are untreated wood, concrete blocks, bricks, and also sheet metal. You can see a picture below where they've used pieces of sheet metal with wood on the outside to hold it together. And really, you're just making sure that you're filling it with soil that's lifted up off the ground. And so again, there are tips for what kind of soil you want to put in there. You can put in topsoil and compost. And again, a good mix is 3/4 of it being your topsoil and 1/4 being compost. And the reason why there's a difference between the soil that goes into a container versus the raised bed is because in a container, you really want to make sure that you're getting the soil to be more light and fluffy. That's why you're using a potting mix there. Those ones have things added to the soil like perlite, vermiculite that add a lot of help with drainage, making it more fluffy. Whereas with your raised beds, it's okay. They're larger, and so the soil isn't going to compact as much. So we wanted to talk about some Philadelphia planting guides, and we have a picture here from the USDA of your plant hardiness zone. Philadelphia is in the 7B area. And really, I use that map for more perennial kind of planting. When we talk about vegetable planting and fruits and vegetables, we really want to focus on the average last frost date. So that date for the central parts of the city is around April 20th. And as you go out further from the center of the city, it might be a week or two later. And this is really like, you want to know that last frost date so that you're not putting plants outside that will end up dying in the frost. Or if you have put out some plants that not seeds, but actual plants, that you'll know to cover them if there's still going to be a frost that night. And then we talk about when to plant things. So I got this great table from the Penn State Extension Philadelphia Master Gardeners. So in this planting guide, they tell you, exactly when you can, at what time of the year can you put in what types of plants. It's also telling you whether you want to direct seed them or if you want to put them in as seedlings. When you take a look at our time period right now, we're in early spring. So right now it's still really, you want your cool weather plants. Those are the plants that can be okay if there is a slight frost or gets a little chilly at night. When you look at, like, say, late March, you see that there's lettuce, radishes, beets, carrots, and they have a little asterisk besides them. And that's telling you that not only you can start direct seeding those right into the ground in late March, but then you can even set up a schedule where you plant those seeds every 2 weeks to extend their harvest. So if there is plants in bold next to the different plants, so like in late March, they have the cabbage family, they're suggesting that you put those out as starts. So those are things that you've seeded inside maybe, or you've gone to a store and you've bought those seedlings, and then you can start putting those out during those time periods. So this is such a really great planting guide to help you decide when to put things out, whether it's cool, the early spring, whether it's warm in the summer, or then at the end of the season when it starts to cool down, what plants to put out when, so that you're actually able to harvest them before the first frost in the fall.
Awesome. So yeah, Tara already mentioned some of this, but I did just want to expand a little bit more on seeds versus transplants. So those transplants or starts are essentially just little baby vegetable plants. And again, you can buy those or you could just seed them inside yourself. And the reason there can be some differences in whether you want to direct seed or use a transplant or start is just because of how different plants like to be started. So some plants don't love to be transplanted, which is often due to a delicate root system. So there are certain plants that you just might be better off with direct seeding. So that could include things like carrots, spinach, beets, beans, and peas. But these are all things that you can just kind of easily look up and see what prefers what. And it's not always a black and white type thing, but there definitely are some options. Like transplants can be more predictable often. And if you're off to a bit of a late start in the season, you might want to try transplants because they've already grown a little bit. And some good options for starts can include celery, tomatoes, eggplants, kale, collards, peppers, broccoli, things like that. So just a few things to consider there. And then I just wanted to talk about like some of the things that I decided to grow the first time I started planting, just because I think it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly where to start. But for me, at least, I know that these were some easier plants to start out with. Things like root vegetables and greens are great options to start with. So like radishes was the very first plant that I grew. And I think that they're a really great one because they grow super fast. They germinate quickly. So if you put seeds in soil, they will pop up pretty fast. And some other great plants to grow are carrots, beets, turnips, kale, and lettuce. Yeah, I just think all of these are good ones to start with if you're not sure where to start.
Then we wanted to offer some ways to save space and increase yield in the garden. So one of our first tips is called interplanting, or sometimes people call it intercropping. And that's where you plant two vegetables in the same space. And you can do this in two different ways. It can be based on their germination rate. So germination rate means how long it takes for the seeds to sprout up. Shannon was just talking about radishes, how they come up out of the soil really quickly. So one tip is to interplant carrots and radishes together. Carrots take longer to germinate. So if you actually mix the two seeds together and then plant them in the soil, the radishes will pop up really fast. You'll see them, you'll know where your row is. And then as the radishes actually make the little vegetable, you can start harvesting those radishes, and the carrots are still, maybe just popping out of the soil. And so then you're actually also loosening up the soil for the carrots to grow in, and you're thinning out area for the carrots to grow. And so you don't have to pull out as many of the carrots that you put in. You can also interplant based on growth rate. So slow to fill out versus fast growers. So some tips on that is to grow slow growing cabbage with arugula, lettuce, or spinach planted beneath it. So you can see the bottom picture, those are cabbage plants with lettuce planted around them. So again, the cabbage, you might put the cabbage in as a seedling and then sow the lettuce seeds in directly, or spinach or arugula. And as the cabbage is growing really slowly underneath, the those vegetables, those leafy vegetables will grow really quickly. So you'll already be harvesting those before the cabbage gets too tall. And then another tip is to do that with your tomato plants. So again, planting in your tomato plant, and then putting in any greens like lettuce, muscalin, bok choy, spinach, tatsoi. And that's actually a really great thing to put leafy greens underneath tomatoes, because you're putting tomato in usually in the beginning of the summer. And so when it's starting to get really hot out, a lot of direct sun, those leafy greens will like being protected by the tomato, get a little shade from the sun so that they don't wilt and die before you can get to them. Another way to save space is to do a succession planting. So this is, you can do, again, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can have different vegetables. So when one vegetable is done for the season, another vegetable is ready to go in. So let's say you start out with your spring planting, like your peas, things like that. When your peas are all done and ready to come out, you can take them out and put in green beans in their spot. So this is where you really want to use that table from earlier to tell you what's good for putting in the spring, what's good for the summer, and what's good for the fall. And again, you can either direct seed things, or you can have your seedlings ready to go to put in. Another option is to do the same vegetables. So you stagger your planting by 1 or 2 weeks to extend the harvest. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Some good plants to do that with are lettuce, green beans, summer squash. That's a really good one. When you put summer squash in, wait 2 weeks, put another crop of summer squash in, and then you get it for a longer part of the season. Cucumbers, scallions, beets, Swiss chard, and carrots. And you can actually use succession planting in a container garden as well. And so these are some of our ideas we've had. So in the spring, you could have a pot filled with radish seeds. And when you're all done, you've eaten all your radishes, and you can use that same pot, put in your peppers, eggplant, or basil in the summer. And then in the spring, you could have a pot with arugula, tatsoi, spinach, and they really like that cooler air in the spring. And so when it starts to get too hot, you can take those out and put in your summer greens like Swiss chard or beets. Beets, you can put them in and you can harvest them as a green and leave some in there to actually make the beet vegetable. And then you can use your shell or snap peas in the spring. And if you put in a structure for those peas to climb up, then you can, when they're all done, you can pull them out and put in pole beans. And the last one we have is potato in the spring. You can put your potato in a really large, deep pot, and then you're gonna let them grow until about midsummer, and then you can harvest those out, and then you'll have that pot ready to go in the fall. You can put in your broccoli, cabbage, those kinds of plants.
Awesome. So yeah, we already saw that excellent Philadelphia planting guide, but I also just wanted to put this one in here. I know the text is a bit small, but this is just a guide that I had from North Carolina. And the main reason that I wanted to put this guide example in here was just to point out that I know that gardening can seem intimidating. Some people think it would be this easy, intuitive thing, but really there are kind of a lot of things to consider. And I don't want that to sound intimidating, but really it's just to say that if you make mistakes, it's okay, and just to keep trying. So some little things I wanted to point out on this guide to consider, like we've already talked about a little bit, planting season, as well as sun, if different plants get full sun or part sun, different frost tolerances. And like we've already talked about the direct seed versus transplanting. But one main thing that I wanted to focus on with this guide is seed depth. So usually if you have your own seeds, you can see how deep you're supposed to plant seeds on the packet that you have. But I know when I first started planting, for some reason my thought was, you really need to get seeds really deep into the soil. So I would stick a whole finger in the soil and then wonder why I wasn't having, plants weren't growing. But you can see even with this first one on our list here, it only takes 1/8 of an inch of depth. So it's really not very deep. And a lot of plants are between 1/8 to 1 inch. So it depends. It's just a good thing to look up and know so that you're not planting too deep or too shallow. And then to also consider things like seed spacing, just because that can vary pretty widely based on what you're growing. All right, so this is one of my favorite things to talk about with planting. I think companion planting is so interesting. And it's basically just when you're planting crops in close proximity that are mutually beneficial. So one classic example are the Three Sisters, which is a traditional Native American agriculture practice. And the Three Sisters themselves are corn, beans, and squash. So you can see that in the image down there on the left. And so they grow really well together because corn plants grow really tall, and that helps to provide, like the stalks provide a space for the beans to climb up. And then the beans help provide nitrogen to fertilize the soil, and it also helps to stabilize the corn. And then the squash plant, it has really large leaves, and those leaves help to shade the ground, which helps to retain moisture in the soil and prevent any weeds. So then that touches on some of our reasons for companion planting. But another reason is for pest prevention. And one of my favorite examples for talking about pest prevention in companion plants is tomato plants and basil growing together, like you can see in the bottom right. Because the smell of basil is actually a great deterrent for certain pests that really like tomatoes. So those grow really well together. And then soil fertility is another reason, like we talked about with the beans, how they provide nitrogen to fertilize the soil. And then weed control, same thing with the squash, that helps just because the leaves are so large to prevent weeds from growing. And then trellising, like from the corn plant, that helps the beans be able to climb up. And then shade as well, same thing with the squash leaves that help retain moisture from shading that whole area. And then one other thing that I think is interesting to talk about when you're talking about companion planting is that some plants can be allelopathic. And when a plant is allelopathic, that basically means that there's chemical inhibition of one plant by another due to the release into the environment of substances acting as germination or growth inhibitors. So basically that just means some plants don't grow super well together because one of them might be releasing like toxins that aren't great for a plant nearby. So I just think this is important to talk about in case you're growing two things near each other and you're having trouble with one of them growing. So you might want to look up if one of the plants that you're growing next to is allelopathic. For example, I know rosemary, the herb, can be fairly allelopathic. So usually when I'm planting rosemary in the garden, I might put it a little bit separate from other plants. And then this is just a little like beginning of a companion planting chart. You can find plenty of different resources like this online. So I'm not going to stay on this page too long, but I did just want to point out that there are lots of different plants that do grow well together. And then again, there are some that are a bit more incompatible. So it's definitely something to consider when you're starting a garden. And all of these things are great to consider, especially if you're able to draw out and write down your plans before you start. It's definitely not something that you really like need to do, but this is just an example that I made a while ago that I found to be really helpful, just so that when you are actually out there planting, you know exactly what you're doing, where you're planting things, so that you have planned out, okay, like these are my companion plants, so I'm going to grow this next to each other. And, you know, this is how far I want to plant these seeds apart from each other. Things like that. So just a little tip that I think is helpful.
All right, so what's next? You know, we really want you to go out, gather your supplies, and plant this weekend. So some Philadelphia garden centers you could hit up are Greens Grow, Urban Jungle, City Planter, and then there's also Lowe's and Home Depot. And if you're looking for a Pennsylvania seed company where you can order seeds online and have them delivered to your house, there's Rohrer Seeds, and it's in Lancaster. And also I wanted to point out that the Fairmount Park Organic Recycling Center, they offer free compost for city residents, so you can bring your own buckets and pick up some compost. And I just wanted to put in here right now, we're still in spring. And so these are some really great plants you can start with. You know, plant some peas, plant some potatoes, put your lettuce, radish, and carrots in. So really, we just want to get you out there, use a container, make a raised bed, you know, do what works best for you.
So yeah, growing food is super fun. So we just wanted to share any little bit of knowledge that we had with everyone and say thank you so much for listening.